some ways, maybe some lessons learned or some tools over the last few years. I'll give you a little bit about my background and share some tools that we have found to be helpful, the conversations that we've found to be helpful, and then interested to hear from you as well and kind of lead you towards some other resources. I think one of the challenges of this moment, several years into a pandemic, and what I would say more years than that into some of the pressure, depletion, and burnout, uh, if we can call crisis in healthcare, is that funny enough, sometimes we're actually, many of us in healthcare are overwhelmed by the amount of toolkits, tools, support that has come in this next wave of the pandemic and of this current moment. And so what I would encourage folks to do is just listen in for one or two things that resonate, that may be supportive, and let the rest go. And I think the greatest opportunity we have right now is just to connect with each other and to speak truth about what we're all experiencing and where we go from here. So a little bit about me. I'm a family and psychiatric nurse practitioner. I am an Oregon native. I see we have an Oregonian on this call. And I actually got my start many years ago running away from nursing school to be a raft guide, actually, which should have been my very first interface with stress exposure in nursing. I've been a nurse now for 25 years. And I was very young when I got into the field, and I think I was just really overwhelmed by everything I was seeing and experiencing. So I did what any respectable nursing student would do and decided to be a raft guide instead until I kind of eventually needed to fund my outdoor habits and went back to the hospital setting. So over my years, I spent the first half of my career, if you could put it in halves, doing emergency and wilderness medicine. I worked for the National Outdoor Leadership School. I taught wilderness medicine really all over the place, nationally and internationally. I worked with ski patrol and search and rescue and in a small rural hospital, and then went on to get my family nurse practitioner degree. And then I worked in the emergency departments at level 1, level 2 trauma centers for quite a while. Until much of that stress accumulation, I guess I didn't mention I did humanitarian aid work as well, and worked in Africa and Latin America. And so sort of all over those years of accumulation, I sort of came to my own moment of overwhelm and depletion. And the thing that actually sent me back to graduate school, I think, was this real curiosity about what would happen if all the people like me who had finally gotten all the certificates and became the nurse practitioner and got the skills and worked, I worked on the north-south border of South Sudan before I went back to school, who learned enough Arabic to get by and who maybe had a cultural understanding of what needed to happen. If we finally kind of got to that point of eldership or knowledge, and then what happened to me was basically just a sense that I didn't want to do it anymore. I didn't want to leave the country anymore. I didn't want to work in the ER anymore. I didn't want to. And I think something that's been very resonant throughout the course of the pandemic is this place where we in healthcare may come to a place of depletion and just feel like, I don't want to do that anymore. And my curiosity was really what happens to the profession that we love if all of us get to that point at the midway point through our career, and we still have a lot of years where we could be offering eldership and knowledge. So I went back to school, got another postmaster certificate in psych mental health as a nurse practitioner, and then started working in child and adolescent traumatic stress and also in first responder stress. And that led me to the clinic where I practice now, which is the Stress Trauma Adversity Research and Treatment Center at University of Colorado. And my area of focus now, it was law enforcement, fire, EMS, dispatch, and emergency workers, and traumatic stress at the interface. But then came the pandemic, and we did a quick about face and really started my work in supporting first line responders, surge ICU, rural healthcare, workers who were on the front lines of the COVID response with the specific mission and desire to just keep people in their seats and staffing ventilators and taking care of themselves in the meantime. And in my lifetime, I had never seen that kind of interface. I'm sure we all felt of needing to go to work, not wanting to go to work. And there's daily decisions that I heard from healthcare workers for the last few years around the double bind, which was, do I abandon myself because I'm exhausted and depleted and I don't want to, I'm crying on the way to work? It was a conversation I had a lot of times. Or do I abandon my patients and my colleagues because we're short-staffed, everyone needs me. If I don't come in, or if I do take care of myself, somebody else has to. And this sort of conundrum that we found in the last few years really came down to the need to really, at least, we didn't have an answer for everything, but we knew that we needed to be able to talk about it. We knew that if you were crying on your way to work and working in PPE for 14 hours, you should at least be able to tell someone what it was costing you personally and keep an eye on that. So the tools that I want to share today come from my own work and practice over the last few years. At the university, we started an effort called Past the Pandemic, which was a series for healthcare workers giving really just-in-time support around, I can't say that we're supporting thriving and even resilience per se, but we were supporting each other to just keep going and be able to feel ourselves enough to know when we were in real distress. And so I'm going to share some of those tools today. I also started an organization called Responder Alliance, and you'll see some of the materials from Responder Alliance. Responder Alliance works specifically with the austere rescuer. So ski patrol, I know we have at least one patroller on this call, Larry, with ski patrol, rescue, avalanche, the national parks, and humanitarian aid, those who work in the austere environment. But funny enough, during the pandemic, that actually became frontline workers as well. So you'll see some of those tools and more of those available on the website there as well. So what I wanted to touch base on today was why it actually matters to have a common language around what we're facing. Very often when we would do just-in-time support into the surge ICUs or the ER, into the communities, I asked the question, what is it that you're feeling? What would you name this feeling that you have right now? What's it called? And I can't see your chat, but you could actually put it in the chat if you like. If you look to your right and to your left, the people that you're working with, what would you name what they're experiencing and what you're experiencing? And Britt, if you're able, if people are putting in the chat, you can just share what they're sharing. What people would sometimes say is exhaustion. Sometimes people would say giving up. Sometimes people would say it's too much. Sometimes people would say rocking it. Not often, but that was the comment. Often we'd hear the term burnout or over it. Sometimes we'd hear people say, I'm planning to leave. And sometimes people say, I just can't. But, there's such a variety and such a similarity both in the experience. Many people would say PTSD or I'm traumatized. Some people would say vicarious trauma. But most people agreed that they were impacted and didn't know how to talk about it with their families or peers. Many people named, as many of you may feel, that the world kind of went on without the healthcare workers. That feeling of being again in PPE for 16 hours and then driving past a full restaurant felt for many people like, why are we doing this anymore? What we've kind of been forgotten. So we spent some time, and I think it's important today to talk about a common language. The term that I became very fond of using working with rescuers and healthcare workers is this term stress injury. Very often in my practice, I respond to officer-involved shootings and mass shootings and big fires and sad events. What we find is that people won't come see me or get support from a clinician in what I would call your professions are high reliability professions, meaning a lot of people are counting on us to be able to walk in the door to my job. I have to prove that I'm still all together, that I'm fit for duty, that I'm fine. And so what would happen is that people would wait until the injury had progressed so far. It was kind of for me like waiting until, and I know our healthcare workers, so I can use this terminology, but waiting till people had diabetic ketoacidosis and they're in the ICU or on the transplant list to say, oh, there's a problem here. Where in every other public health emergency, we would get a hemoglobin A1C and look for early signs of stress or illness or impact. And so I found that one of the greatest challenges with supporting occupational workplace stress was that we didn't have a common language or term for it, and we all had to wait. It'd be like saying, I don't know what's wrong with me. I feel terrible. I'm thirsty. My stomach hurts. I'm peeing all the time. I don't know what this is. I'll just keep going. But as soon as we could name it, and particularly if we could recognize it early, we could start to do something about it. And I learned that the military actually was using terminology around stress injury. In combat operations, it was called occupational stress injury in the Marines. I found out Canada was using the term occupational stress injury. So operational stress injury in the military, occupational stress injury in Canada. And I was like, why aren't we using that term? That sounds right. It seems more like an injury or an exposure than a disorder because it's actually common and predictable when exposure happens, and it can be supported once we know what's going on. So here's a couple of truisms that I learned over time treating first line responders of all types. That these injury types that occur in the workplace actually occur on a continuum. So post-traumatic stress disorder or burnout or substance use or depression or anxiety are all presentations that can occur from occupational stress, but at the late end of the spectrum. But there's also many other ways that this plays out. Many of these injuries actually have early and late changing vital signs. I can't think of a patient I've ever treated that was fine one day and PTSD the next, even after a major incident. If you look back on their occupational history, usually there was first exhaustion and depletion and signs that they were struggling before these big events or burnout or post-traumatic stress occurred. These injuries are physical injury types. I think this is so important. It's our body that actually has to do the work of stress, not just our minds. And we've maybe made a mistake by relegating stress injury and post-traumatic stress disorder and all of these that I'm naming to the realms of the psychological. So we try and treat it only psychologically when really, if you have to secrete cortisol day in and day out because your job is stressful, because your life is stressful, because you're depleted, and you don't see hope of that changing for a long time, your body cues that as an emergency, and you secrete life-saving emergency hormones like cortisol. Remember, cortisol is a backup generator to our fight or flight system. We can't sustain in fight or flight, so the next best thing in times of crisis and famine and war is to secrete cortisol because, we all know this, but as a review, it keeps us up at night in case there's an emergency. We'll be on hyper alert, so we don't sleep. Keeps us on edge emotionally, so we're looking for threats. We put off long-term jobs in our body, like our our immune system. We put off things like laying down bone density and building things in our body till later. We live in an inflammatory state. And if you're in a civil war or famine and you're secreting cortisol, think about prednisone, you actually accumulate central adiposity and keep your blood circulating really high because you don't know when the next food's coming and you're ready for anything. Now, do any of this really sound psychological or do they sound physical? So the long-term impacts of living under stress, even for a few years consistently, where it feels like there's always a threat, is actually a physical injury type. And it plays out, as we know, with ulcers and pathological fractures and inflammatory illnesses, etc. Our bodies actually pay the price. So stress injuries are physical injury types, and burnout is a physical injury type, and post-traumatic stress is a physical injury type. And I think we need to include that in the conversation. We know from living through this pandemic, at the very least, now I may refer to the pandemic, but remember that these cracks in the system and the way we did healthcare existed before. I think of COVID or some of the other processes that we've been through in the last few years as an accelerant to what was already there. It's like pouring gasoline on an already existing smoldering fire. So when I mention the pandemic, I just mean these last years, let's say. But we've learned that when you're impacted by stress at work, your relationships suffer. It's an energy management problem where you have less and less energy to invest in anything outside of just surviving. And so, of course, our relationships suffer. But the good news, because all that sounded kind of rough, was that we can actually support these injury types once we know what they actually are. Like, oh, that's what's going on. I have an exposure injury from work. It's like being exposed to hazmat exposure at work. Like, oh, that's why I feel this way. Okay, that's what's going on. This is what I can do about it. Now, for some of us, it's not just about the occupational stress. For some of us, work might be the most peaceful place in our life. So although we're going to talk about occupational stress, we really should think about this as life stress. Here's the equation I think is really important when it comes to traumatic stress, like PTSD formation, things that we encounter in our workday, on our shifts, on our calls. There's a predictable pattern that stress injury, like I'm talking about, and particularly traumatic stress injury, is more likely to occur when you're already in a place of depletion and stress, which means that if you had a really difficult code or resuscitation or call last week, how you went into that call is really has a lot to say about how much that will impact you. And the mystery of that broken down, really, like if I get a call that there is a major event or a shooting or something, and I go to support, for instance, firefighters, I'm so much more interested in how those firefighters were doing the day before that call, because the ones for whom they already felt overwhelmed and exhausted and depleted and like the scarcity, there's not enough for me, will feel like that event is happening to them. Where the ones who actually are coming into that event with some capacity to respond don't tend to get as hurt by traumatic stress. And so that's, I think if there's a take home here, it's that there's something we can do to prevent those injuries by addressing and recognition of that early stress. Now, this is a equation, if you will, that I use a lot. I hadn't been doing this work for very long, working in a traumatic stress clinic, talking to folks in the parks and healthcare workers and doctors in the ER. People kept tugging on my sleeve and saying, hey, it's funny, but it's not the resuscitations. Okay, what they honestly said is it's not the dead bodies that are causing me to feel the way I feel right now. It's the exhaustion, it's the short staffing, it's the leadership changes, it's having to constantly train someone new. It's mission stress, feeling like what I got into this job to do is not what I'm doing now, and I never get to mission satisfaction. Where all that meets the trauma, that's where the injury occurs. But for some of us, maybe we don't have a lot of traumatic exposure. It's a lot of wear and tear and accumulative stress and mission stress that makes us feel pretty exhausted. So in terms of a common injury, I was doing this work in Aurora, Colorado, responding to the events that I shared. And I was working in the ER with a battalion surgeon who said, hey, we use a stress continuum model in the military when people show up on deployments. And this has become really important to me because I feel that a lot of us who've responded in the last few years, whether we have a stable job, it's like we kept getting deployed to another surge and another round of the pandemic. And for many of us, it felt like we were actually doing the kind of humanitarian aid that I used to get deployed to in our own in our own hospitals, in our own life. But the different was like when you get deployed somewhere, you get to sleep in a tent and not do anything else but respond to the crisis. But for most of us, it was like, and when you get done with that, can you homeschool your kids? And can you do mass vaccination campaigns? And can you educate the public? I was like, man, they would never ask us to do that on deployment. So I really liked kind of thinking about what we've been through as in a deployment kind of framework. I saw that the military was using this. When people showed up on deployment, they would get color. They were either operationally ready, they were reacting to stress, they had been injured by overwhelming stress, or the term that we now consider critically injured, they were experiencing constant or disabling distress. And I loved this stress continuum the moment I saw it, because what it points out, there's a couple things that we know intuitively that we were noticing, which is, first of all, was that stress isn't binary. You're not fine all the way until you have a diagnosis of something. For almost all of us, there's a moment that you go from feeling calm, confident, loving your work, feeling mission satisfied, to reacting to stress, and a change from your normal amount of focus or energy level or engagement. And then there's probably another progression to being injured by that stress. And then there's another progression. And the reason I think this is important to us in a common language is that to be able to recognize where you are on this continuum and actually to find your way back to what mission might look like gives us a new conversation. I think for many of us, at least when I got into this profession many years ago, I watched the people I respected the most, who were amazing nurses in the ER and physicians. You know, I worked at burn trauma centers. I'm like, those nurses could start IVs on babies with burn, any of it in the dark probably. But then I also watched them drinking more, having relationship issues, becoming quote unquote crustier, more irritable. And it just looked like the progression. And I think we have to question that, if that's true or if there's another way. So I took this back to Aurora, Colorado. This is my body of work. And we actually calibrated this for fire, EMS, law enforcement, dispatch, and we've brought it to many populations, including ski patrol, including nurses, SENS, educators, rangers, you name it. But what was interesting when I first said to these groups, like, tell me about firefighters or cops in the orange or red, they were like, there were so many examples. Oh yeah, I worked with a guy last night, didn't come to chow. Every call is a problem. Everything I say is wrong. Or they just clam up, they disappear. You know, the minute we're done with the shift, they blame other people, they blame themselves. Get all these, and you could kind of look at this and think about the people that you work with if you have examples. But here's what's really interesting. When I then said, okay, tell me about someone who does what you do, who's in the green or trends toward green, who has a sense of mission, who's emotionally and spiritually healthy, who has a life outside this uniform, who's got healthy sleep, mission satisfaction, room for things to happen, margin. It's like total crickets. And, you know, I wonder what comes up for you now. But matter of fact, when I said this to the cops in the room, they, you know, some people said, oh yeah, I just got this brand new person in. It's like, no, not the brand new people. The people who've been doing their work as long as you have. What's it look like for them? And it was just silence. And I was like, wait a minute. Did we all kind of make this cultural agreement that if we're going to do this work for long enough, we would lose our sense of mission, we would lose our capacity for gratitude, healthy sleep, that this would be like what becomes of us? So this is a stress continuum, and we use it in a lot of environments now to just really as a self-awareness tool. A lot of the teams I work with, they might put it on badge cards or just have this language like, hey, some of them check in at shift change or at the beginning of their seasons or their trainings. And what's cool that we find out is a lot of people, a lot of healthcare workers spend their time moving back and forth between yellow and orange. So people might feel like, oh, I'm not doing very well, I better autocorrect. But very few people have practices that are built in that sustain them moving toward green. What we know right now in healthcare is that very few people can sustain themselves in green without a lot of intention, without practices like saying no when things get overwhelming. And I'm sorry, I can't come in to help even though you're short-staffed. And I have these habits or practices of going to sleep at a certain time of night, or taking care of myself physically, or getting out for exercise. That a lot of that, it was kind of built in, was sort of eaten up in the last few years. And now we have to kind of think about what recovery might look like to get back to a place of more of that mission satisfaction. And maybe the reason it matters, I've already shared with you, is that we can't control the kind of events that we're going to come across in our career. But what we do have control over is where we land on this continuum. Because remember, those who are already in the red or orange when these big events happen will more likely go on to develop things like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and particularly into retirement. And so we don't always, the farther you are into the orange or red, the less it actually feels like a choice. But knowing that green is still a possibility and maybe even a birthright in medicine and in healthcare is powerful. I think that many of us get into this. I'm also a professor at the College of Nursing. I realize, when I was going through my training and when we train other nurses, we rarely have this very important conversation that I now have with my nursing students and say, healthcare, survival in healthcare is about economics. You would not spend all of your life dollars in the first half of your career in the same way you wouldn't, and not put anything back in the bank. In the same way that if I short economics lecture, I said, well, what happens if you spend all your money every day and nothing goes back in the bank? What happens when the head gasket goes out on your car? That's traumatic stress for me in a nutshell. And we've never had really a culture in healthcare where we say that is vital to your training and learning how to start IVs and giving meds and calculating drips and doing all the things that we do, is learning a sustaining practice for putting money back in the bank, emotional energy, battery recharge. And so there does tend, without paying attention, we do tend to have this predictable progression toward the depletion of all those resources. And what's happening, I think, universally in healthcare right now, and there's a lot of conversation about wellness and self-care, but what is difficult if you're me and do this work every day is you recognize a lot of those practices are built to be what you do in your spare time, how you build that, how you recharge your batteries outside of work, where mission satisfaction, you got to go get that somewhere else, where being physically and emotionally healthy have to happen before you get to work. But we don't build that in as a part of our regimen. So if I had a magic wand, and I could save the future of healthcare, as I mentioned, was kind of a passion for me, it would be about creating culture around how important and good it is that you said no to coming into another shift because you had to take care of yourself, that you're taking that vacation and investing in recovery after the pandemic, that you have practices that we actually applaud in the workplace, like good for you, you went for a run before you got here, that we would have places even at work where you could recharge and rebuild your batteries instead of expecting everyone to do that on the outside. So that is, I think, why that common language is so helpful. We often will spend a lot of time, we'll identify that the farther you are pushing into the orange or red, the more likely you'll be using numbing, or what I would call clinically survival tools, which means to me, if you're a cop, for instance, or a nurse who is even drinking on the way to work, and this is not an infrequent call that I get, maybe you get a DUI on the way to work and everyone goes, well, you have a substance use problem, and maybe you do. But another way to look at that is, if I'm in the red and I cannot tolerate the way it feels to be in my body and go to work every day, but I have to get through 3 more years to put my kids through school, I have to find out some ways to numb, to get this job done, to support my family. And I think that's a much more useful paradigm. Now, what happens in healthcare is that we don't always numb out with alcohol or prescription meds or affairs or porn, and that can certainly, all of that's in the realms. But a lot of people in healthcare actually stop feeling their bodies by helping other people, by working more, for signing up for more, for taking care of other people. And the problem is that everyone thinks you're amazing for doing it. So while it's contributing to your injury type, everyone else is like, oh, thank you so much for picking up the extra shift or coming out on this rescue. And it just perpetuates it. Or maybe we pick numbing tools that are socially really not just acceptable, but lauded. You know, I work with a lot of, elite athletes and patrollers, etc. Maybe your numbing tools are exercising way more than your body can do, or doing things that are super risky that help you not to feel. And someone's like, that was so cool, I'm going to put a GoPro on you the next time you do that. You're not going to stop doing it, but it will come at great personal cost. So one of the things that we often do as an exercise is to, and we won't do this today, but this might be something that's helpful to think about. This is a very simple exercise to actually just ask right now in your own life, your life battery, your work battery, like what is draining that battery for you right now? And some of you might say, again, short staffing, having to train others. My leadership doesn't understand what I do. The patients are becoming more and more difficult to work with. My job description keeps changing. I'm exhausted. And it might be easy for you to generate a really long list there. If we had more time, then I might ask the same, like, but what actually is charging your battery right now? Like, if I gave you 2 weeks to just go do what you know your body needed for recovery, what would you choose? What does your body need? What does your life need? Is it just quiet time staring at a wall? Do you need to get out in the mountains? Do you want to get into a quiet library with a book? Do you feel like you need to lay on a beach or just in your backyard, or you need to get your feet in the hot springs or in the ocean? Is it literally around, I just need to eat some food that nourishes me. I need more sleep. What I find with most healthcare workers that I work with is this one's a really challenging one. Sometimes people can't generate even 2 things that would feel really good right now in your body. And there's a lot of reasons that we got to this place, but what I think this exercise helps us to see is if there's a ton of things draining your battery and you can't even think of or execute even a few things that charge your battery because you're too busy or too exhausted or too many people need you to come in and work an extra shift, then we can predict that there is a predictable pattern of depletion that will, if not right now, inevitably move you over toward the red on that stress continuum. And so just pausing here to be like, what would it take to even figure out what charges my batteries? What would it take to make 1 or 2 what we call green choices? So green choices, in a nutshell, are the things that help us to slowly set our eyes on what green might look like, even if it's in the far off distance, and start making methodical, slow, intentional steps every day to take 1 step. Most people I work with who've moved toward orange or red in these last few years say you don't like walk back or take steps back to green. You probably claw your way back. You first have to believe it's possible. And then you start small steps, like I'm going to make an 8-hour sleep commitment because I know my body recharges itself when I sleep. So I have to do that. Not every day, maybe just 5 days a week. I'm going to make a commitment to exercising to bring that hyperarousal and that cortisol level down, maybe just 2 days a week, because my body needs to move and discharge all this built up energy and arousal. I'm going to create some space in my life, whether it's just turning the radio off on the way home or sitting in my car for 10 minutes before I walk into that crazy house where everyone needs me. I'm going to offer that to myself, or I'm going to say no to another shift so I can just lay in my bed until 11 o'clock just once a week. Those are all steps of those green choices of putting something back in. I'm going to tell at least one person where I really am on the numbing, the stress continuum. And so that, I think that language, this is a worksheet that we'll often use with folks just when I work with teams, just to start generating ideas. I mean, sometimes people have to go home and ask partners or best friends or, partners on the job, like, what do I do to recharge? Like, I can't even remember. What's one place I could get more connection in my week? What's one thing I could do to offer more rest? Let me just name what one of my numbing tools is. For me, like it's always surprising to me how much I want to hide my numbing tools. Not because they're particularly bad. I mean, it might be watching Bridgerton until 2 a.m. on Netflix. I mean, no one's going to get hurt. But because if I tell someone, then they'll know when I'm doing them, and then they'll know that I'm struggling. And here's the craziest thing I've learned with healthcare workers with the stress continuum. For the general population, they'll come out and tell you right away, like, I'm struggling, I'm not doing well. You know what I've learned about healthcare workers is crazy? The farther that many get into the red, the more energy they put into hiding it. So they take if you look at the stress continuum and think about it as a scale for energy management, we actually get into a moment where you realize you have very little energy left in the red, and healthcare workers will keep going and hiding it at great personal cost. And so that's why we sometimes actually need to tell one person how we're actually doing, because that's the first actual step toward moving back or changing that moment that we're in. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. Those, if I can get back here, I can at least see your chats. I've been talking at you for a long time. The piece on psychological first aid here is that we really can go back to the foundations, I think, of what helps us after crisis. I think there are very few of us who wouldn't identify having been through crisis and needing to start thinking about recovery. And so many of those green choices, psychological first aid at its foundation in crisis mitigation is around reestablishing safety, reestablishing physiological calm, finding real connection where at least one person knows how you're actually doing, and then finding our own efficacy or empowerment to get ourselves out of this moment. Those are the 4 elements, and the 5th one is hope. And I think hope with a common language in this moment actually comes from revisiting who was I, or what would it look like to live more trending toward that green. This is my one precious life. Like, how do I bring more vitality or more ease or more mission satisfaction? Is it possible? And if so, what does that look like? I think a lot of us are just like, I don't know where I am. I'm on a slippery slope. I don't know when this is going to stop. And this, hopefully having a common language allows us to at least start thinking and imagining, well, what would it look like if I was moving more toward green? What would my sleep look like? What would my connections look like? What would a vacation look like? Many people right now say they go on vacation, but it takes them the first 4 days to just come down. Like, wait, is that vacation or is that recovery? What's vacation? What is joy? What does fun look like? So I want to pause there and see if there's any questions or thoughts. I'll share where you can get more of those resources to the conversation, but I wanted a chance to kind of listen in what folks were thinking.
Feel free to jot those in the Q&A section or even in the general section. I'll get to them either place. Don't be shy, guys. I'm sure that everyone has the same question. Okay, great. What is your definition of burnout?
That's a really interesting question. You know, I find that some of our words have been used so many times now that we don't know what they mean anymore, or we may have an aversion to them. So there is a clinical definition of burnout, which I think has to do with spiritual, emotional, and physical deficit or depletion exhaustion. But I think that of my definition would probably be more around stress accumulation without adequate recovery. Because burnout, actually, as a ICD-10 code burnout, it takes on average 12 to 18 months for recovery. And I think I want to say, and I want us to know that it is a longer arc. We didn't get there overnight. There is no, if anyone says, here's your 1, 2, 3 step to um, to fix burnout, I'll be like, boy, what's that going to be? But I also think that we need to know that it's possible that this moment that some of us are feeling, where we actually have always relied on our ability to just reach down and pull out more surge capacity, and then we're like, reach down, we're like, there's nothing in there. It feels terrifying. And we're like, I used to love this job and I don't anymore. I think I also really want people to hear and know that I've seen many people make a return from that place. I've made it myself, but it takes time and a lot of that intentional commitment, like we would do maybe with a diet program, more than just an overnight kind of response. It takes planning and intention. But what I think helps the most is at least being able to picture and imagine what it looks like to walk in the doors of our job full of mission, like actually having enough capacity to respond to the complexity in front of us and still finding joy and recharge in our work. And that's, again, where I think at the very heart of it, if we could picture what it might feel like to be green and know it's a possibility, that tends to start leading us a little tiny breadcrumbs back to like, I can't keep saying no to that. I'm trying to get there. I know where my destination is.
Best practices for dealing with an acute traumatic event.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. I might refer you to some resources on that one. At the heart of traumatic stress, I get a call on a lot of these events. And on the Responder Alliance website, we do have some protocols to use for support, and there are many. But my favorite definition of traumatic stress is actually an incident or a stimuli that overwhelms our capacity to integrate it. So most of us, our birthright is that we're going to see a whole bunch of hard things in our life and we're going to just keep going. We're going to do well. We're going to overcome. That's at the heart of it. When we in Georgia Bonanno's work and our studies, resilience is actually where most of us land. And if you look at work on disasters, even in communities, we go through it, it dips down for a long time, we really struggle, and then we come back to that same level or even post-traumatic growth better than we were before. So my curiosity is always around what gets stuck for people. Why does that survival switch get stuck in the on position sometimes, when for most people it just goes right back into life functioning? So it's usually around the event being too overwhelming to respond to it. And that might be because it's too surprising or too tragic, but for many of us, it's because we're already so overwhelmed. And anytime that our survival brain registers, I can't deal with this, we're at risk for traumatic stress. Because really at the heart of every trauma formation that I've ever supported is helplessness. So I've worked with people who were at Columbine, who went through major events, and they're like, we did our job there. We loved that. You know, I feel a sense of mission satisfaction. We did everything we could, and they tend not to be traumatized. The ones we see that have trauma accumulation are the ones who feel like they couldn't respond, or if there's an if only, or I wish. And so, really at the heart of it is paying attention to depletion in that moment, and also giving people back their power. What can you do in this moment? What is within your power? How can you tell your survival brain, if this ever happens again, I can get myself out of it? And I know that's kind of an overview answer, but there's no one thing we can do, but I think the awareness and also the feeling of empowerment, like what can I do for myself? What can I do for my colleagues right now? What can I do for my depletion right now? Even if it's going home and sleeping for 12 hours, is incredibly impactful. So I'll share my screen again because I put some of those resources at the end of this conversation. I just put some extra ones in there in case we talked about them. But at the Responder Alliance website, under resources, we talk about how the stress continuum is used on teams in common language. Larry, you might appreciate it's ski patrollers, I think, who are doing a lot of those conversations. We talk about psychological first aid and how it helps in traumatic stress. And there's actually a 2-hour modular course on psychological first aid and what we can do for other people in that immediate aftermath. The passthepandemic.org, we continue to support healthcare teams. And we do a webinar, there'll be, I think, 5 or 6 this summer, specifically on how to support teams. We didn't talk about today, but teams get injured by stress as well. And so how we use this common language and best practices to help support teams that have been injured or impacted in the pandemic.
Laura, will you share that screen again?
Yeah,
where you're talking about the resources?
Yeah, did it share? I can't really tell from here, so there you go. Can you see that screen?
Not yet. Mm-mm.
All right, 3rd time's a charm. Let me try this one more time.
I believe in you.
Thanks. Share. Okay,
there we go.
See? Great. Yeah. So these are the two the references to websites where some of this information. There's a toolkit on Past the Pandemic, and the psychological first aid best practices, including a guide, are on there. But they really do come back to those ways that we reestablish safety very tangibly, create calm, offer connection, and then allow people to find their own empowerment or efficacy, and then giving them a structural plan for what will happen in the next hours and days following the event.
Awesome. Are there any more questions or comments or anything that anyone would like to add? Larry said great things. So thank you for the question. And I will also link Laura's information as well as her organization's information within the email that I send out, just so if you do have any other questions or anything like that, we can have that for you as well too.
Well, take care, everybody out there. I know it's a huge topic, and I would be, again, I feel like selling you something if I was like 1, 2, 3 steps, just do this. But I think being able, what we always say is awareness, then choice. So first of all, in any therapeutic modality, an awareness and an acceptance of where we really are in the process. And then all of a sudden we have the opportunity to start making new choices. I am going to sleep more. I am going to say no more. I'm not taking on that extra shift or that travel assignment right now because I have to take care of myself first. That's, I think, where we see the cultural change and the power lie. So.
Well, we thank you all for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of your day.